Good evening. You're watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with Dave Frank. Welcome back after your trip.
Thank you. Good to be back.
And
Appreciate you guys holding things down while I was away.
all right, well, we're going to do a little bit different show this time around. We're going to do one sort of topic, and that is the political state of the United States at the end of 2022, which I think is probably one of the most interesting years in U.S. politics we've had in quite a while. And that's saying something because every year is interesting, but we've had some real interesting things happen this year. And we aren't necessarily limited to the following topics within that topic, but we want to kind of, during this course, cover a few things such as the failure of the red wave. Everybody was talking about the red wave. I wasn't. I want to just say, reemphasize that. And it turned into just a red nothing almost. I mean, they did make some gains, but and then the kickoff of the Republican Civil War. I don't know if you've been watching some of the headlines, but there's already salvos between Trump and DeSantis. Coming on, but not even that. McCarthy is not even completely guaranteed, although I think he will get it. To the Santos thing, we got the economy. What role did it play in the election? Inflation, but yet the jobs reports were remaining robust. Is there going to be a recession? We've got the end of the federal guarantee of reproductive rights under and a very aggressive Supreme Court that's talking about reversing other things, including, equality of marriage, the decision, and other things, which has led to some bipartisan legislation to address that. We can summarize that. Then, of course, there's the January 6th committee, and what they came out with their final report, long thing. And with some recommendations, criminal referrals for Donald Trump and Eastman, but also ethics violations for other people, including some of their fellow members of Congress. And then the other big story of the year, and I know I'm missing a few, was the war in Ukraine and how that's gone and what that says about Biden's leadership, and how do all these things tie into the next election cycle, which has pretty much began the day after, November 9th or whatever it was. And then, the big question is Biden going to run for reelection? If not, who? And so there's a lot to talk about in there, but why don't we kind of start with, the big news being the midterm elections, and we can kind of work our way from there, Dave. Any particular angle you want to approach it from?
So one big picture thing, I guess, because we're talking about like sort of if you look at weather versus climate, right, leading up to the midterm election, there was so much talk about, if you listen to kind of right-wing news ecosystem of the economy, how Biden, is just destroying his leadership is, harmful to the country, and he's responsible for the inflation, and just, we got to vote against the direction the country's in. There's certain things the president can do, certain things the president can't do. We've talked about at length this year, and I just think it's worth mentioning that in terms of the big picture over the next couple of years, the Fed is really the tool, the instrument that is going to affect the ability of the administration to tame inflation. That's where they're leaving it. And just to give you an idea of this arc that all the politics of the next couple of years are going to be wrapped around. They're going to keep increasing rates from this current level through next year. Now their baseline's like 4.5%. They're going to go up to 5.5%, but they're signaling that they're going to drop it in the next year to 4%, drop it in the next year to 3%, drop it to 2.5% beyond. So the question is about a recession.
And real quickly, they've already started reducing their rate increases from 0.75 of a point to 0.5 point, which means that they're trying to avoid a recession as they try to get inflation tamed, and particularly with regard to food, because that's just inflation is relentlessly applying to that.
Yeah, they're shooting for that so-called soft landing. That you hit the nail on the head. That it's the extent that there are mechanisms and levers that national politics have any influence over at all. The overall amount of money in the system and the difficulty of people to access that money or use it. And so that's the Federal Reserve piece. And I won't get super in the weeds on this, but just a couple of indicators. The stock market is down, depending on the index you're looking at, down about a third. So that this year to date, so that reduces people's feeling, not everybody, of course, about, I think it shouldn't be used as a proxy for the economy anyway, but so that's one indicator. But housing, right? So pending home sales are finally slowing down. It's like down almost 40% year over year. So we're finally starting to see this cooling. A lot of people have equity in their houses. They think it makes them feel rich. They spend it. So a lot of these things are starting to slow down in the macro picture. One last thing on this is unemployment, because that's where it affects people's lives. And the powers that be, the titans of economics, have said they need to, somewhere between 1 and 3 million people need to lose their job in the next year to slow down the economy.
It's ridiculous. I mean, there's other ways to approach it, but we can talk about that.
Totally. Yeah. And Lawrence Summers even said, well, if we're going to do this quickly, then maybe we just need 10 million people. And obviously nobody wants that. And 150 million households we're talking about, that's like not quite, whatever, that 7% of people would have to lose their jobs, which is terrible. So anyway, so there's this tightrope. My point is that there's an economic tightrope. All the other things we're going to talk about, that's one frame point of reference. And so policies that people recommend have to keep that in mind, and with it, spending and investing in the workforce, investing in improving the lives of people is people are always going to say, well, maybe you're spending too much money. Maybe it's not a good time, ... But it's always a good time to try to improve the lives of people if you are a leader, a true leader. So I think that's in terms of the economy, I think that we don't really have to talk too much more about it. But you said the energy costs and food costs, those are not going to be impacted so much by this. That's going to be more, I think, relative to fear and greed in the markets, and also the war in Ukraine. So I don't know when you want to bring the war in, but I just want to bring like one big, sort of foundational piece of this is the economy that all this is going to operate under.
Right. And the food is not dropping. Gasoline has dropped. It's still dropping, partly due to reduction of demand due to the weather. But also, I think that the oil companies are realizing they made a mistake by, they made some short-term profits through the roof. And I guess they wanted to send a message about their power, right? But what they did was they generated a demand for electric cars, which is now creating a push to revamp the grid, the power grid, to be able to accommodate it, technology, arms race and technology, alternatives to lithium, alternative ways of obtaining lithium, and pushing for all kinds and replacement of fleets, with electric vehicle cars. So they realize that with all of the gasoline coming from despotic governments, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Texas, wherever, it's really, that's where the people don't want to be dependent on them anymore. And so with Russia trying to make Europe pay the price, it's just going to lead to a push for more alternatives. And this is why I wanted to kind of link the topics together and discuss them more holistically, because it blends with the January 6th committee. We don't know how effective it's going to be politically in the long run. We don't know if voters are heeding this, if it was a factor in the midterms. It's really hard to tell. But we do know that they just issued a report, and we've got a lot of social scientists all around really analyzing. I had somebody remind me, you should go back and reread The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, which is an excellent book. Some of its theses are questionable, but some of the parallels to what almost happened in this country and what could still happen are chilling. Maybe it's not completely accurate. Maybe the comparisons aren't there, but the comparisons are being made. And so that's why I wanted as one of our topics to be, the January 6th committee findings and the future of authoritarianism, because that's linked with our energy policy. People don't want to be dependent on Russia or Saudi Arabia or Iran or any of these countries where this is coming from. So how do we become independent of that? Well, of course, some of the conservatives would say, well, our own drilling. We need to do offshore drilling, be able to drill off the coast of Humboldt, be able to do all this stuff. But other people are thinking other types of energy. Even some environmentalists over the past few years have been rethinking nuclear power, particularly with new technologies. And now the news about fusion, which they're saying is 30, 50 years away, but some people are kind of winking and nodding, saying it could be as close as 15 years away before we have a first fusion generator. It's hard to say. Fusion is always just around the corner. But there's so much to talk about in this. And also, one of the things that happened that I think is really good, authoritarianism has a hard time flourishing with massive public participation. Our turnouts for elections are up, over what they were 10 years ago, 15 years ago. We have youth becoming involved, maybe not so much in numbers, but they voted. The ones who did vote voted Democratic this last time around. And partly because of what is happening with SCOTUS, and that decision that they made, the Dobbs decision, may have been a turnaround in this, or pushing for the turnaround, because I think that we're headed for more progressive politics. I just hope it's not too late to save the planet, but we are headed towards more in the future. The talk about Latinos and black voters leaving the party. There's some evidence of it, but I think it's overblown. I think the story has been overblown. It's localized in certain areas. It did not prove to be the case, at least not very strongly in Arizona and Nevada. There's so much to talk about. We've only got an hour, and I'll let you jump in here.
Yeah, it's interesting that, as you were talking, I'm thinking all of these things really do overlap, and it's understandable that so many people, and I wish it wasn't the case, but there are a lot of people who kind of get overwhelmed in the minutia, or overwhelmed in the apparent feeling that what can I do? Like, we're talking about things like authoritarianism on the rise around the world, and the cost, that the impact of maybe that cost on our lives in terms of energy and food costs for the whole world. So there are things we can do, and there are things that are important, and there are things that affected, I think we could say, the rise of Trumpism, MAGAism, and also ways that is starting to turn into a circular firing squad within the Republican Party. I don't know how far down that road you want to get, but I'll start from the beginning of that thought and kind of end up in the Republican Party. Maybe we could pick up on that a little bit afterwards. But I think it was called the social. Oh God, there's a documentary about social media. And it talks about how polarizing it is, because the algorithms behind online social media basically feed you things that provoke you, and so it ends up that people begin thinking, oh, I'm a free-thinking, moderate person, but then they spend a year or two or three in an information ecosystem that makes them only view certain things and never speak. I say always and never, not super accurate, but for the illustration purposes, less and less likely to talk to each other, less and less likely to actually get an enriched and informed cross-section of opinion. And that in that climate, when bad information, misinformation, hysterical and provocative information, it really travels 6 times faster. They did a study, I think MIT studied it. And so anyway, people are getting provoked and people are getting agitated by technological autopilot in our information ecosystem. And authoritarians around the world are taking advantage of it, not just in their own domestic sphere, but not to rip open a whole new subject here, but Putin himself, Russia. I mean, the intelligence community there and the intelligence communities of other countries that are sort of provocatively anti-Western, China, you would argue, And Iran is in this picture too. These are folks that have a real vested interest in undermining the power of coordination in democracies and undermining cooperation between democracies. And so that's a huge issue globally, but it plays out in our own domestic politics too. And the reason I start from this perspective in talking about the Republican Party is because you've got people that are traditional conservatives, air quotes, who know this too, and they see it harming them too. That's why they did so badly in the midterm election. The candidates, the hysteria, the conspiracies, just there's a whole set of specific reasons, but it centers on this tail wagging the dog phenomena that we've got going on with Donald Trump himself. And so that sort of circles back to, I know I'm talking a bunch here, but it circles back to the January 6th committee's final report, because they're not going to be around in a couple days.
That's right.
They did pass along recommendations for prosecution, which very well may play out in the Justice Department. I'm curious to hear DOJ. Curious to hear your thoughts on that at some point soon. But also,
special counsel is subpoenaing like crazy.
Exactly. And one last thing I'll add, then, and to get some feedback from you on this, is that some of the January 6th revelations that came out this most recent release was that Trump's chief of staff. People have testified he was burning documents.
That's right. That came out in the release. And that's huge.
So there are true obstruction of justice crimes that they can hang over everybody around Trump himself. So that's one key thing. One last key thing is that, and we can pick up on this afterwards, is that it's the case that Trump is also facing a constitutional elimination. There's an amendment, 14th Amendment rule that says if you're involved in insurrection, you can't run for office. So that's something that's very real and very new in our conversation.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back and pick up on this.
I think I've made mistakes. I mean, every time somebody says I made a mistake, they do the polls and my numbers go up. So I guess I haven't made any mistakes.
We showed up and we demonstrated that we would not have our voices silenced by a Republican Party that across the country had a singular intention on suppressing the right to vote.
Some Democratic senators seem to imagine they could just break the rules on a razor-thin majority. Nothing would stand between them and their entire agenda, a new era of fast-track policymaking.
The Republican Party moved very far away from reality. And the fact that you got colleagues of mine in the Senate who refuse even today to acknowledge that Donald Trump lost the election. How do you deal with that?
Joe Biden is the president we need right now. Battle-tested, forward-looking, honest and authentic. He has never forgotten who he is fighting for.
All right, why don't we focus a little bit about the Civil War aspect, because you kind of ended on that. Trump may not be able to run. I don't know if the Democrats really want that strategically, because probably the biggest danger from the Republicans at this point isn't Trump, but DeSantis, governor of Florida, who has completely transformed Florida for the moment into a red state. Goes off the deep end in some ways, plays well to his base. May have a hard time bringing in some of the center. And one of the things this election did reveal is there are still people who vote for individuals more than party. Not a huge amount, but in a close election, it'll happen. It benefited Fetterman. It benefited the Democrats in Nevada. Which was one of my failures, the predictions. I thought for sure Republicans were going to take the Senate in Nevada.
Georgia too.
Georgia. Well, I thought that Warnock would hold on to that, but still, in fact, I thought it would actually be not quite as close as it was. Although it turned out it was 3 points final. I thought it'd be more like 5, but still. And I don't believe, the media was making a big deal about, because of the polls, how close Arizona was. I don't think Kelly was ever in any danger of losing, quite frankly. But other elections happened that were closer, statewide ones, including Kerry Lake. But I want to focus on this point because We've already linked energy policy towards authoritarianism. We've got a lot of people who are classic conservatives in the Republican Party who are even setting that aside to ally with Democrats. Steve Schmidt, for instance, and the whole, I forget what that project. Lincoln Project. Thank you. And others willing to break off to help win. And the question is will they see DeSantis in the same light? Because DeSantis, by some analysis, is Trump with a brain, with a political brain, who knows how to play politics, and probably wouldn't have embraced the Eastman plan, but has watched very closely and learned that you can stretch the rules a bit, strain the systems, and he's clearly doing that in Florida. I mean, just ignoring things, everything from the felony rule. That should allow felons to vote, to finding ways to intimidate voters not to exercise that right, all of this stuff about late night, these things, and now he's going to be opening an investigation of a Christmas night drag show. He's playing to the culture wars and the extreme of it. Will that help him in the general election? I don't know. Florida is a different kind of place right now, but it's not that red a state technically. And there are people who say, well, yeah, I don't agree with all of that, but he's a good leader, right? So the Democrats are going to have to be really careful about this and really careful, clear on their messaging about authoritarianism, because in my view, DeSantis is an authoritarian figure. He wants to be the alpha male of Florida politics, and if he becomes president, the only difference between him and Trump will be his subtlety, as far as I'm concerned. Other than that, he scares me more because he's more effective. So do we want Trump to be barred from running, or do we want them hammering each other in the primaries to set them up for a Democratic run, for their whoever they're going to be running against, whether that's Biden or somebody else?
So I'm not sure who we are in this picture, but what I would say, but what I would say here is that there has been a line that was, this is my take personally, like I'm not speaking for any group or of course, but there's been a line that was crossed here with the way Trump administers governance and his the impact he has on people's lives. Not so much in the policy arena, where I feel like he's relatively ignorant and accomplished very little other than that tax cut that everybody wanted on his team, Republican side. That's really all and the Supreme Court justices. These are
42.
These were huge things, and immigration blockage. The COVID was able to inform that, and he postured on immigration reform. But I think actually we could have a better, more effective immigration. We could have more effective tax policy. The justices are where he really broke things, actually. But anyway, we're talking politics. We're talking Trump versus DeSantis, I think, basically here, or turning the page. My take on this is that the page has to be turned. Because of the threat at every level. It's not just this international ignorance. It's not just national political ignorance. It's also at the local level, like getting people amplified and agitated to go storm their school boards. And the Steve Bannon approach to burning down the the administrative state, I think is his terminology for this. They want a revolutionary change. And I don't think there are very few leaders and titans and scions of the Republican families in the country or parties, just activists even. I don't think there are that many people that actually think that's an effective way to run a community or a state or a country. So from that perspective, from their own team's perspective, I think they need a change. When it comes to everybody else, I think we would benefit from and I know this is cliche, but some degree of normalcy where we could actually do like T-charts where we talk about the pros and cons of particular issues, talking about issues on the merits instead of it being some visceral, emotional, cultural backlash to how we feel about change and how we feel about the future. It should be about what is and how we make what is better.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about that, and definitely the DOJ should not base its base its decision as to whether or not to prosecute on either the political fallout, one way or another, whether or not it's going to mean people are going to think that they're being biased, partisan, and whether or not it's in this Democratic Party's strategic interest. They obviously have to, if Trump really did try to overthrow an election and took major steps towards it, that precedent cannot be allowed to go without some type of consequences.
And I want to agree with you 100%. One of the things I forgot to say here, and you underlined and reminded me, the January 6th committee did make the case that there were actions taken. They just released, I think it was, 800 communications that came out of the White House requesting that local actors and state actors and other departments of the government engage in fraud. So the obstructing the peaceful transfer of power, the administration of the governmental electoral process, these things happen. And legal experts have said repeatedly over the last year probably that if you treat it like an organized crime prosecution and view it through that prism, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at a hub and spoke organized crime relationship where an alpha leader works through surrogates and tries to do anything in their power extra legally if necessary, wave after wave after wave of trying to get their way, which ultimately led to the January 6th events. And I think that this is pretty well documented. So the case can be made. The question is who's going to make it. And from what I've read, each state kind of has their own candidate eligibility requirements and processes. But the state of Utah has already sort of tested this by saying, I think there was a judge found a ruling that a particular candidate was not eligible because of their participation in what effectively is an insurrection. So there's already at least one precedent that at least one judge has seen it through this lens. And the question is the capacity and the will out there to carry this out in any other states?
I actually think when Merrick Garland appointed the special counsel, that was actually a decision to prosecute at some point. First of all, he has political cover because it's going to be up to the special prosecutor. And the special prosecutor is being very aggressive in investigating this. Subpoenaed, asking for everything from January 6th, has now actually subpoenaed Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia. I mean, there's a lot going on there, and it's hard to imagine that they're going to draw any conclusion other than some laws were broken. And whether it's incitement to insurrection or, just simply attempted interference with a congressional process, we'll see. But Merrick Garland, I think, has provided himself the cover. He says, I appointed a special prosecutor. He has to approve it in the long run, but he's going to say, you know what, this is the investigation. These are the findings. I find that there are grounds. So the question is will he do it soon enough in time to prosecute in case there isn't a Democratic president in 2 years? But if the prosecution is going, I think there are Republicans now that want Trump out of their lives, and
exactly.
So I think there'd be immense pressure against that. Where I have some hope that authoritarian politics are going to be limited in this country, not as strong as they've been over the past couple of years, is the Republicans did take the House, but just barely. Yeah. And the difference is about 20 very moderate Republicans either barely held on or barely won. They're not going to want to sacrifice their careers so Jim Jordan can get off on, interrupting people and trying to impeach over Biden's laptop, Hunter Biden's laptop. I don't think they're going to let that happen. They'll let this happen and Jim Jordan will get his show, but I don't think they will vote to impeach. And so it won't even get to the Senate. And of course, it wouldn't pass in the Senate. I don't think actually impeachment, I think it's a bad process. I think they need to, at some point in the future, revisit because it's too politicized the way it's set up. It needs to be more judicial involvement in it, and whether it's in the decision making or the process setting situation. But that's a whole other story. But because of the Republicans that have taken over, and then in some Democrats too, I think we need to look at. Now, I'm not a big fan of saying that Democrats need to moderate in order to attract a larger group of voters. I think if you stick to your policies and you're reasonable about how you express them, it's fine. And quite frankly, everybody's saying, oh, she was a moderate, but I think they really need to look towards the Washington's 3rd congressional district. It was a major flip. It's being called the biggest upset of the election. But Marie Gluesenkamp, I hope I'm saying that name right, Perez, flipped a seat that should not have been flipped. And I've talked about this before. I drive through that all the time. It is a very conservative area of Washington state. But it had a never Trumper, one of the 10 who voted for impeachment. That person didn't survive the primary. Instead, a full-on Trumper won, and then this woman won, and won because she's different from Democrats in some key issues. One is she's a gun rights advocate, supports controls on assault weapons, but also feels that the Democrats need to change their rhetoric about this. Also feels that the Democrats need to change their rhetoric and how they approach crime. She isn't even talking about different policies, but she's saying that don't be dismissive of people who are suffering in communities who are suffering from crime by citing statistics about how it's not really happening. It is happening. It might not be worse than it was 10 years ago, but that's not a sensitive way to go about it. She's a different kind of voice, and she is very much geared towards addressing climate change. And the like. So and very aggressively, she's a different kind of. I don't even want to call her a moderate because it doesn't really apply. She's got issues where she's more conservative than others. But Democrats have to really look to their constituents. She's someone who did. She's of course fits the. She and her husband own a mechanics auto mechanic shop and the rest. I think that she is the key towards Democrats expanding and maintaining a permanent majority in Congress. Towards reclaiming some of the Latino votes in the south of Texas, towards a lot of these things by changing a different, taking different rhetoric and taking a different approach to things and taking things seriously. And maybe I don't want to use the term woke because that's become the trope for right wingers, just like politically correct always was, misunderstood. But maybe back off some of the cultural warfare that is basically comes in the isolation of the left academics and left bubble culture and start really trying to make an approach like John Fetterman did. Get out into the countryside and talk and learn how a different language. If Democrats can do this, and they can coalition with the moderate Republicans that are probably not going to want to sacrifice their political careers just for the good of Republicans who want to maintain crazy, I think there's a chance that we can kind of return to a sense of not just normality, but a different kind of approaches. Maybe more Republicans can address the issue of climate change and reject denialism. I don't know. I mean, I'm hopeful, but those are my thoughts on the possibilities.
I know we're wrapping up this segment, but I would say that you point to articulating your values and standing behind them, and then explaining why you take policy stands the way you do. And I you can point to both parties for this, but the Democrats are the ones where I'm probably more critical because they
should be different.
They should be different. They should do a better job. They're like underneath the surface. At least one would hope that they actually do want to make things better. But there's a communication disconnect that people tune it out. That like when rural voters are asked, how they feel about certain things, and you only talk about the policy, they listen and they engage. But when you say, I'm a Democrat and I'm here to talk to you, they're like, nope. I know I'm overgeneralizing, but there's a book out about it, how they don't in many cases, we have 3,300 counties across the country. The blue ones are on the edges and in a few cities. So at the very least, some serious soul searching and drastically reformed outreach on messaging clarity needs to happen.
With that, we're going to take a brief break.
Tonight I stand before you, tested by adversity, made sensitive by hardship, a fighter by principle, and the most optimistic man in America.
I didn't make it in life because of my athletic prowess. I didn't make it because I'm a genius. I made it because I worked hard.
There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. It is the latter category that tend to be the difficult ones.
When I hear your new ideas, I'm reminded of that ad. Where's the beef? Yeah.
And the client asks you a question. How do you guys get comfortable? It's a question. So, what was your answer?
Mr. Chairman,
did you tell him?
Sure, Mr. Chairman, I'm just trying to understand.
No, I think you understand it. I don't think you want...
All right. Well, you talked about how, the Democrats need to work on rural counties. Of course, you and I live in a rural county. Now, we've got some benefits here. It's a university. We've got a university town. We've got the back to the land hippies that kind of moved up. A lot going for it that makes it different from a typical rural area. Obviously, there's a lot in this about how to talk to people and the rest. And, we also need to know that people to understand that when parents encounter a book in their schools where their kids are being taught that whiteness is a bad thing, it's one thing on a college campus to explain that whiteness doesn't mean white people per se, but that's a lot to ask of people who don't have that education, who haven't benefited from critical race theory classes, on campus, and don't want their kids to be taught. That's not even politically partisan. It's bad messaging, right? It's not the way to frame it. Certainly not to a fourth grader or whatever, right. Where that goes. And you can, later in college, you can kind of explain when we're talking about whiteness, we're not talking about somebody who is white and what they think or feel. We're talking about a tendency. Well, that's a real, again, maybe we need to come up with a different word for it, because what it does sound like on the surface is attacking white people, and the majority of people in this country barely, but, are still white people. And there are a lot of people of color that don't approve of that. I know of a Latino woman, a friend of mine from college, who used to be very active in the Latino political groups in college, who basically re-registered Republican because she says, as a teacher, she sees the bullying of people who don't think quite woke is her term, and the rest. I want and she's not a right winger. And I'm not, she hasn't done that. She's not politically educated in the same way I did, and she won't necessarily vote Republican the whole time. But she has, and her belief is that, when I say, well, the Republicans don't believe in democracy, blah, blah, blah. And she basically said, well, the Republicans are attacking the body of democracy, but Democrats are attacking the soul of democracy. That's a pretty profound statement for somebody to make. We need to, and what she's talking about is, in her view, what's happening on college campuses is, she says, that's authoritarianism, telling people what they can or can't say in a classroom. Now, we need to look at it, and it's obviously more complicated than all of that, but we do need to look at these things. And in some ways, some of the extremes of the left in how we've expressed ourselves was what led to people supporting an idiot like Trump, right? How that person got elected. It's just, it's that way. So we need to talk about it in that context. When we're talking about the economy, it's like, okay, it's not a recession, and we could say, see, it's not going to be a recession, but a lot of people are hurting. It feels, if the word recession means bad economy, it feels bad to them. So we need to, be sensitive. Well, statistically speaking, the inflation isn't true. Well, if food prices are going up, that's something that affects everybody at the working class level. Even gasoline isn't that universal because not everybody owns a car. Right, it's food, and that and so when food is, and it's fine to talk about how food is going up all around the world, and how there's not much a president can do, but at least show some empathy that, we understand that food is probably the most important of all of the prices and the rest. How we talk to people, that's the state. How have Democrats learned a lesson? Are they learning a lesson? Are the Republicans learning a lesson?
Interesting. Yeah. And so I suspect that the answer is a little bit easier for Republicans because although they weren't that successful in the midterm election, they have tapped into the sort of simplicity of message that how people's lives are actually affected, and speaking to whether it's not just speaking to fears, it's also speaking to trust and suspicion, and so for example. I saw a show, Chris Cuomo. He's no longer on CNN now. He's got some independent relationship. I'm not sure exactly what media outlet he's on, but he had Bill O'Reilly from Fox on his show.
Oh, interesting.
And they were talking about criminal reform and prosecutors, just prosecutorial discretion. Like one of the talking points nationally is look at San Francisco, where the prosecutor's so radical and they're not, criminals have gone amok, and it's not actually really all that true, but it's massively cartoonishly lampooned across news across the country for months. So people really do think that there's this awful thing happening when it comes to prosecutorial discretion. And anyway, so Chris Cuomo was basically trying to use some facts, and he was saying there's some facts here, Bill. And Bill said, oh, Chris, there you go again. You're thinking about it. You're trying to argue about it. He's like, anti-crime, pro-police. Simple. That's what people want to hear. They don't want to hear anything more than that. And I'm not saying that that's the right way to go because there's an old cliche: if every problem, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Yeah. So I'm not endorsing that, but I'm using that as for illustrative purposes. So what does that mean? How does that translate? Well, look at COVID. Look at how COVID hit the United States. Look at how ill-equipped our medical community was, not just to provide the services that we need, because they had the services. We have one of the best, most effective and technologically advanced medical systems. It's that the delivery and the participation rate and people's comfort and people's trust and people's access and people's affordability. We've got a huge chasm here to bridge. And who can speak to that is really, I think, and I'm just using this as one example, but issues like that. When it comes to climate change, we have to talk about things like fire, wildfires and droughts and water access to water for farmers so that we can have food. These are existential threats that we all are facing, and there's just two camps. One is saying less filling, and one saying tastes great. Like there's sort of this rote. You have to do everything, all in. You have to do X, Y, and Z, massive transformation of the economy. Or the other side is saying, you guys are crazy. Let's ignore it all. And that's not the path for. I guarantee you, if you look at the bell curve, the vast majority of people realize a pox on both your houses. You're not explaining to people in ways that they understand what actually has to happen and how it's going to happen, and why we do have to make some sacrifices, like not everyone's going to get access to a big V8 sports car like in our nostalgic recollection of our youth. Maybe in the future there's going to be really fast there are really fast electric cars. You look at the Tesla Plaid S, it's as fast as a Bugatti almost, which is a multi-million-dollar car. So anyway, my point is on every single policy issue that's of importance to us, that's what needs to happen. And I think it's important. I know we don't have a ton of time left. I think it's important to we address now Biden's leadership and break it out, maybe go to foreign policy, because there's a place Ron DeSantis has no foreign policy experience to speak of. There's Mayor Pete, what was a Kinsey consultant and has military experience. Arguably, Mayor Pete would be a great voice out there trying to explain to people in a way that they understand from the Democratic side. And is there somebody who's thoughtful and engaging on the Republican side that's not DeSantis? I wonder, and maybe people have ideas about who that might be. Like I'm not even going to speculate because I don't. But
You
that's
got
what
7 Republican senators that voted for impeachment. Any one of them could look at it, but they're all struggling just to be reelected. So we'll see.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about this in the context of, we're going to be talking about for the next couple of years what a rough time Democrats are going to have in the Senate. Again, it always seems like they've got the rough time, but they're going to be having to defend Sherrod Brown in Ohio, John Tester in Montana. These are red states. Again, I don't want to overstate it because there are a lot of people out there that do vote for individuals, and both of these individuals have really developed a solid support system across the board in those states. And Sherrod Brown is actually pretty liberal. So how does he do that? But, we talk about how do we talk about things, and, you don't want to respond too much with statistics, but, the big argument about, well, all of these liberal DAs in major cities that have these, don't prosecute every crime policies, and it leads to these other things. I mean, the problem is there isn't a whole lot of difference between the crime in liberally run major cities and conservatives. Oklahoma City, Jacksonville, Florida, Mesa, Arizona, all very conservative administrations have crime problems through the roof. Nobody's, talking about the fact that their prosecutors prosecute everything on a conveyor belt, as that. So the Democrats really do need to have to hit back and say this, and and they have to hit back on inflation, saying, look, yeah, we have this 7% inflation, but most of the rest of the industrialized country, it's in the double digits. We actually did pretty well through this global situation caused in part by the war in Ukraine. We haven't really discussed the war in Ukraine yet. Obviously, its impact on food has been big, even with these details. In the time we have left, why don't we talk about what's going to happen? Does Biden run for president a second time?
Yeah, I think I don't recall if you and I had this conversation because it's just I just don't recall that. But my take on that is. Who else is there? And there's so much infighting within the Democratic Party about its direction and one element of this, and I wish it wasn't the case, but it's just something that I've observed, is that as Vice President, Kamala Harris is not very popular.
Not so far.
And hasn't really done a particularly good job of making any kind of transformative changes in the policy portfolios they've put her in charge of. So then the question is, who besides her? And so now you've taken a relatively highly qualified Black woman that is very high up in the party, very powerful in the party, and told her she needs to step aside because someone else is going to be running instead of her. That first step is big. You also have to tell Hillary Clinton to stay home. That's pretty big.
You don't have to tell Harris, though, not to run. You just let her run, but she's not going to win the primary, I don't think. I just don't think she can.
Yeah. So I'm saying you start down this process. I had this list of like the top 10 people. There are some people who are saying maybe you need somebody like a really popular mayor like Eric Adams in New York, and I don't even think he's that popular, but people are saying that he is. And so anyway, that there's these sort of out there candidates that really haven't made. Gavin Newsom. People are saying Gavin Newsom would make a great candidate. But I think because there's so many options and it's far too important to the party to coalesce around one candidate because you have a sitting president, a one-term sitting president. I just think sort of almost the default reaction is going to be, stick with Biden. I hate to say it, but I think that's what we're going to see. And maybe I shouldn't say I hate to say it, but we could talk about Ukraine maybe on a follow-up show. But the idea is that he actually is one of the more most experienced foreign policy presidents that we probably have ever had. Now, there's generals and stuff, but he's been around. But Biden's been around. He's seen a lot of things, and he's been in the room in a lot of these cases. He's got connections all over the world.
And let me just point out there that I am critical of Biden on all kinds of things, but the way he has handled Ukraine, the finesse and the dedication, and not even trying to take credit for it, is not only been effective but very admirable.
Right.
I have to say that about him. I'm saying that as someone who's leaning against wanting him to run again. But I have to say there's nobody I would have wanted I would have preferred to be in office when this war broke out. Not even Bernie Sanders, whom I'm an absolute fan of. I think that he was the best for that. He has handled it with finesse and and competence over and above. So, I just want to say that, but go ahead.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's one of those things where the world is a very complicated place. We are talking about the leader of the United States, but we're also talking about the leader of the free world, and his capacity that he's already exhibited was very successfully, getting a coalition of allies together. The regime. Sanctions regime and a response to the energy and food and inflation crisis and also the subtlety of which weapons, framing this as a defensive battle that we're defending allies who were invaded. I know this is a hugely complicated thing, and very many, there are lots of progressives out there who would much rather peace at all costs, but they don't. I think that's an extreme position that isn't necessarily correct. Just to call it out. I mean, this is the Cold War, the extension of post World War II order. There's the Washington Consensus. That means the United States is the core foundation of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Bank of International Settlements. So all the money, all the business, and also militarily as a the big partner in NATO. The global system is our responsibility at this point, whether we like it or not. And it feels good to say, well, in my idealized, in a perfect world, it's hugely
it's not imperfect. A perfect world, but we know, at least I know that I would have supported World War II even earlier than a lot of other people did, America First and all of that. And I don't know if you've ever read Michael Walzer, but he has a book, Just and Unjust Wars, which I think really outlines when sort of a progressive kind of semi-pacifist like me would support a war. I'm sorry, but I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine qualifies on several different levels. When you're talking about potential for genocide, when you're talking about an aggression of one country over another, there have been very few military actions I would have supported since World War II. Possibly, I opposed it at the time. Possibly Gulf War I, not Gulf War II, but Gulf War I, because I just don't know what the alternative is now that I'm thinking about sanctions weren't going to work as we learned in the long run. Not very much else, and that's something that progressives have to deal with, and we are, of course, having our own civil war about that. Okay, well, last prediction of the year. Dave, what do you got?
I think it's already pretty clear, my prediction at this point, and unfortunately it's not going to be for 2 more years or so, that it truly plays out. But I do think the Democratic Party really has no choice but to continue to support Joe Biden to be the candidate. And I think that the earlier that for president for 2024 to try to get reelected, I think that any other path would take away from the strength currently right now that we have in our global struggle, both with Russia and with China. I think we're well positioned to endure, but the Democrats shouldn't really mess this up by trying to be too clever.
One thing we don't know, though, is what are the health factors, and there could be things in play that Biden is saying, I simply can't do it. We'll see, because there have been some issues that have come forward. But I'm going to make a contingent, and this prediction might not have any basis in reality for anything in potential, but contingent on Biden not running, my prediction is these four will step up to run. Gavin Newsom, we know it, he's been positioning himself. Gretchen Whitmer, who won a very crucial election in a very crucial state, a bellwether state. If Bernie Sanders does not run, then Ro Khanna will run as the standard bearer of the left of the Democratic Party. And then another possibility here is Roy Cooper, governor of North Carolina, who seems to be able to win those types of states and knows how to win those voters. I expect that there will be more if that happens, but I know I'm predicting that those four will do it if Biden it doesn't run, and he's going to be under pressure to say one way or another by the end of January.
Yep.
All right. Well, that concludes the show for the year. Well, until next year, stay informed and stay engaged.